Well, good evening, 3RMT FM. This is Radio City and All-Star Radio here with Jeff King and Greg Pickover. Good evening, Greg.
Good evening, Jeff, and welcome everyone to a Saturday night in the city and a quick rundown on what we've got planned. About a 90-minute interview with Bill Graham, the major promoter from the period, who of course ran the Fillmores on the West Coast and the East Coast, and now is personal manager of Santana, the Grateful Dead, Eddie Money, amongst others. The Fillmore on the West Coast ran at a number of locations in San Francisco for 5.5 years, beginning with a benefit concert for the San Francisco Mime Troupe in the November of 1965, until its final week in July 1971. It presented probably the widest spectrum of musical acts possible, and the Fillmore on the East Coast ran for 3.5 years, winding down in June 1971. They established a whole style of rock events, quite different to anything that had appeared beforehand. The artwork, the sound systems, the bands, the light shows, the clothes, the company and the community were quite unique and specific to San Francisco in particular. The Fillmores ran benefits for many groups. They held seminars, played basketball, ran marriages, ate Thanksgiving dinners, and on New Year's night, a special night when they stayed open from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. and celebrated the arrival of the new year with breakfast. And here is a radio summary of those times, and we're really indebted to Steve Smith at Readings Records and Mike Cunningham for loaning us many sides. And before we go to the first section of interview with Bill Graham, I just wanted to set the scene of the interview. Bill Graham was in Australia last spring with Santana, who came out to two dates in Australia under the dubious title of Rock Arena with Fleetwood Mac, as many people will know, and probably went along to the Calder Raceway on a very fine day in November. And the station was interested in getting an interview with Graham and Carlos Santana, the latter, who we discovered doesn't do interviews. And I went along thinking I might get 20 minutes with Bill Graham about this and that and the current state of the art, really desiring to get the sort of interview I eventually got. And I spent about 2.5 hours with him on the 14th floor of the Hilton as the sun set over Melbourne on a warm spring night, talking about San Francisco. Graham is a great person to interview. He has had a variety of jobs throughout his life, ranging from a waiter to a soldier to a cab driver, statistician, office manager, actor, loafer, theatrical producer, and eventually a promoter. And he talks in an extremely jovial, raconteurish style, with all the magnificent traits of a ham actor who engages one on all fronts. He tells everything with his body and his hands as well as his mouth, giving the punchline of a particular story with his face and actions before actually giving it verbally. His energy and enjoyment in talking with us about San Francisco is obvious from the interview, and it should be pointed out that it was interrupted from time to time with business phone calls, and Graham would often answer the phone swinging into the demonic business person that is portrayed in the film, the Fillmore film, and to cope with the details of whatever requests or demands were being made of him, and dropping the frenzy as soon as the receiver was put down and returning to the charming, engaging character you hear in the interview. Despite the business problems, Graham seems to have retained a sense of proportion and adventure about the last 15 years or so. And we begin the interview by asking him a question of why he chose, or why he came to San Francisco, and what he'd been doing up to that time.
Well, the first one I was drafted into the Army, but I was just passing through. In 1955, my background is Europe. I was born and raised in until I moved to New York, and after the war I found a few of my sisters, and the first sister that came over had friends of hers living in San Francisco. So in 55, just when I finished school in New York, she landed in New York, and I flew her and her family to San Francisco to settle her, and I fell very much in love with the city, just the layout. Went back to New York, got my things together, and moved there for good. In the next few years, finishing school, I wanted to work for a business and did accounting work, statistical work, office management work, and got interested in the theater. Decided to bum around a while struggling along as a character actor, and Finally, in the early 60s, I decided I didn't want to work in offices anymore. I think you have to try things and then fail to realize that you don't want them. I think when you're a kid, you say, I want to be a fireman. Well, once you become a fireman, you say, my God, it's a drag. Well, for me, it was administration and office management, and I thought that's what I wanted to do. And when I wasn't happy having achieved that, I went into the theater, and in the mid-60s, had to make a big decision, and finally left business and went to work as the all-around gopher for a radical theater group in San Francisco called the San Francisco Mime Troupe. We did live shows in the parks and radical political statements and such. And having been busted by the law, we had to raise some money for our defense, and I'd gotten to know in the 60s, in the mid-60s, some of the poets and some of the sub-bohemia of San Francisco and some of the musicians and some of the filmmakers, and I decided to call on them as a fundraiser for our troupe. And the first show we had was in the mid-60s, in November 1965 to be exact. And the first program I ever did, it turned out to this day to be the greatest night of my life, theatrically, because everybody was nude. Nobody dressed fancy on purpose, and nobody did their hair fancy. And later on, everybody tried to look groovy with their tie-dyes, but it took them 9 hours to get dressed, and everybody says, I'm just casual. Well, that one was the real one. And Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky and Frank Zappa and the Fugs and the Warlocks who became the Dead, Jefferson Airplane, and ironically, it's always of note for me to give you some example of how little I knew about rock and roll at that time. Somebody called me a few weeks before the show and asked if they could be of help. He said he represented an organization called the Family Dog. And I said, fine, come on. And I put them on the program, and when they arrived that night with all these other artists coming, I asked them where the dogs were. I thought it was a dog act. And of course they were another organization putting on musical shows. It proved so successful from the standpoint of raising $4 or $5 grand for the artists, but as well as for many of us, it was the first time that people who were very conscious of what it's like to be open with one another. It was my first experience, and especially having been a New Yorker where everybody's a con man, including myself. You just try to be an honest con man. Well, people, men dance with men and women dance with women, and people danced in 5s and 3s and 9s, and people smoked freely, and it wasn't trying to be hip or groovy. I always remember that as the most honest event I'd ever attended, because once something becomes successful and once something is, when it works, then it becomes slant commercial, then slant duplication, and slant Xerox, and how can you mass produce that? Well, that one was the genuine article, and I shall always cherish it as being the pure event for me.
That's almost, in fact, 12 years ago to the day. I think it was November the 10th that night was on. Sure. I looked it up in the Rock Fact books. Yes. That I've got. And I wanted to ask about why is that possible in San Francisco, or why was that possible at the time in San Francisco?
I think certain things are overlooked in that everybody always talks about the law and the pig and the capitalist. One of the good things then as now about San Francisco, and I don't know the reason. First of all, there are two for me. One is that credit must be given the law there, because the law didn't always have just a laissez-faire attitude, but they didn't think smoking of marijuana was going to make us all dwarfs and was going to make us extinct, the extinction of civilization. And they were pretty loose from the very beginning. They didn't clamp down on that, as they've never clamped down on, it's not a brothel, but they don't clamp down on prostitution. Or they don't put you in jail for 9 years if you're going 3 miles above the speed limit. And they pretty much allowed people free speech in the parks and open statements about how they feel. The other is that I've always, including myself, the shortest description of the people who live there for me has always been, it is a city of professional rejects. It's such a beautiful place to live in. I was a frustrated actor, even though I had business background. For 7, 8 years, I tried my hand at character acting, and I went from Europe to California, to back to Europe, over to Asia. And I didn't have the talent or the luck or whatever it might have been. And there were so many dancers there, and painters there, and actors, and writers, and sculptors, and voyeurs, and romantics. The city's flooded with romantics, i.e. the suicide rate and the rate of alcoholism and drug people. But looking at it from the positive side, if you're interested in the arts and you have aesthetic values and eclectic values, and you're going to live anywhere, and you can't do what you want to do, which is being successful at whatever that is, what a good place to live. Yeah. And therefore, there is this conglomeration of people who have feelings, people who have statements to make, and who may have been frustrated in their inability to put it out there in other places, gravitated towards San Francisco. I know I did. So the combination of a pretty lenient law and a citizenry that had and has always had a desire to express itself, I think makes San Francisco what it is.